Today I'm chatting with Cara Weinstock, owner of online vintage store Cara Mia Vintage. Cara's known by the fashion set for sourcing the creme de la creme of vintage couture in Australia. Her store is a collection of carefully curated designer pieces we're used to seeing on the likes of Linda, Cindy, Naomi and Kate. Cara's literally spent decades scouring from afar and afield to accumulate her archive. But today we hear how her baby Cosmo, capricious markets and coronavirus have found her to favour her style at home. Okay, so Cara, I've been a big fan of your online store for a long time, and it's just funny because I probably only noticed on your Instagram a photo of yourself a little while ago, and then I put the pieces together and realised that I recognised that cute little face. And that we've gone to school together, so it's been a while. So I think you were like a year or two below me.
I definitely recognise you now that I'm seeing your face.
Yeah. A few more grey hairs.
You haven't changed at all.
Yeah. You look exactly the same, honestly.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so funny.
So as I said, I've been a fan of your website for a really long time. I noticed Vogue did a feature on Cara Mia Vintage, it was like a good 5 years ago. And I remember being a bit surprised at the time because not a lot of vintage got included on the pages of Vogue. So how long have you been running the business for?
I've been running it for, I think it's about 8 years now.
Right.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
I was in various other industries before this. I was did a media degree out of school and worked in media for a while, and then went back to university and did law and worked as a lawyer for a while, and just felt that I didn't really fit into the corporate world. And vintage was a passion of mine that I just developed. It started as a hobby, and it just seemed like a natural progression for me to move into that when I was looking for a new career path.
Okay. So what was your relationship to fashion? Was fashion always something that you were into, getting dressed up, or?
Yeah, I think it was definitely something I was into sort of from late teenage years. I mean, my mom was very and is very fashionable. And has always.
I think I even remember your mom.
Remember my mom?
Yeah, I do.
My mom, was always into her fashion, and actually my mom's parents owned a men's clothing store in Burwood many years ago, but that was really a very different part of the fashion world, I guess you could say. But yeah, that was vintage clothing was something I became interested in, I think, fairly young. I started going to markets and up shops when I was probably 16, 17, 18. And then I spent quite a lot of time in my early 20s traveling. So that was something that really opened me up to all of that. I spent time in Europe and America and places like New York and London, especially, where vintage was already a big thing, much bigger than it was here. Australia kind of probably still isn't quite where those other countries are. But yeah, I guess 20 years ago, vintage wasn't a thing really.
It wasn't. And growing up, I mean, I remember my first experiences with op shops and that my love of vintage clothing came from the same time when I was about 16 years old. And I was actually literally this morning, my daughter went into my wardrobe and was like, what's this Hawaiian shirt? And I'm like, Mum, that's Mummy's first op shop piece that she's still very proud of.
I love that.
But it wasn't, it was something that wasn't really that big in Sydney or in Australia. And I remember trekking out to Blue Spinach because I wanted to find that store and know what that was about.
Yeah.
How did you get introduced to it?
I remember going to Paddington markets, since I was quite young. That was the local market, I guess, in the eastern suburbs that had a bit of vintage. And then Rozelle markets. One of my best friends she grew up in Five Dock. So we used to go to Rozelle markets. And I remember finding at Rozelle markets when I was probably, maybe 18, I found a Versace couture dress for $10, literally $10. And it's a very famous dress. It's one of the dresses, the George Michael video clip, the Freedom, where the supermodels and it's one of those dresses, like that collection.
Yeah.
So I recognize that, even though I wasn't that knowledgeable about fashion yet. And I think for me, I was like, wow, this really has value. Like, this is something that I found for $10 I knew that this is worth so much more than that. Plus it looks really cute on me. So win-win. It was more out of an interest and a personal interest. Like, at that point, obviously it wasn't about wanting to start a business. It was just that, I loved clothes. I wanted to buy cool clothes, and I didn't have tons of money to do that. And I didn't want to have things that were the same as what everyone else had. And I think even from a very early age, fast fashion was not appealing to me. I think when I was a much younger teenager, yes, I loved Dottie. I remember shopping at Remember Dottie. But I just was never very interested in that genre of fashion. And I think when I discovered vintage secondhand, it was like, okay, here's this whole other world of clothing that is unique, it's beautiful, it's beautifully made, and it has a history. It has all these different elements that make it special. And I just kind of dived into that, and then I started looking everywhere, and the more I learned, the more I knew what to look for, and I just started collecting. And I think that's how it all started.
So how did you have the guts to take it from a hobby to a business?
I don't know, stupidity, I guess, probably. I think it was part being very passionate about it, part having this huge collection that, like, it was more than I could possibly wear or store, and also being unhappy with what I was doing at the time. And this just seemed like, okay, why don't I give this a go? I mean, there was one other, particularly the idea of doing it online, was very kind of different. I mean, I never really
especially like 8 years ago, still
I never really considered doing a bricks and mortar store. I did work for a really cool vintage store on William Street in Paddington called Melvin and Kyle. I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
That was a cool store. I was working for her, and I think while I was working there, I started thinking it'd be cool to do something like this online. And I'd seen, there was a few cool sites around, but, I think a lot of vintage online, I mean, these days there's a lot of options, but I think 8 years ago it was quite limited.
Yeah.
There was eBay. I think Etsy had kind of just started all of different websites selling vintage in, to varying degrees of success. So it just seemed like something I could put my stamp on, or attempt to put my stamp on.
Yeah. So you're an eastern suburb Sydney girl.
Yeah.
And with a love of fashion, but I guess the temptation is to keep up with the fashion girls and be wearing the latest trends. How have you kind of kept that sense of elevation but brought the vintage into the way that you dress?
Well, first of all, I guess I specialize, like my true passion is the designer high-end stuff. So
Yeah.
I've kind of always veered towards that luxury high end of the vintage market. But having said that, I think there's tons of great vintage out there that isn't necessarily a designer or isn't necessarily a designer that's super well known.
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of that's another thing that I love about it. I think there's so many great designers who've kind of been lost to history. Like maybe they weren't around for a very long time, that people just don't know about, that, you know, were creating amazing things. But I think for me, you know, the appeal of a vintage Chanel piece is infinitely more than going into the Chanel store and buying something new. You know, that's just to me, that's always what I've been attracted to. Like I will always pick a vintage piece over a new piece. So
do you like the challenge of it?
You know what? The thrill of the chase is definitely a big part of it. Definitely. And I always feel in a way, you know, once I get my hands on something, it's not as thrilling anymore. It's part of it is just hunting it down and finding it and possessing it. But once I have it, sometimes it's not quite as satisfying as I imagined it would be.
I imagine though, once you do have it, it's also hard to let go of it, especially if it has been a good find. So
definitely can be.
What are the pieces that you go, no, this is too important to me, I keep this for myself?
I've got quite a, you know, not a huge collection, but a substantial collection of vintage Vivienne Westwood corsets that I've sort of been collecting over the last 15 years, that I haven't sold any of them. And they are very hot items at the moment on the vintage market. So I have had a lot of offers. People have seen some of the pieces I have in my archive, but they're just something that I'm not ready to part with. And I can't imagine that I ever will want to part with them. Also because I've had them for such a long time. Another piece that springs to mind is a designer called Ozzie Clark. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
60s designer, right?
Yes, exactly. English designer, and he wasn't around for such a long time. His label wasn't around for such a long time, so these pieces are quite rare. And I have a dress of his that I've actually never even worn. It's a beautiful silk chiffon, like floor length maxi halter dress that I always said, you know, maybe one day I'll elope in it. Like, but I haven't, but I still have it. And I don't think I would ever sell it. It's just something that I've had for such a long time now. And it also reminds me of when I started buying vintage. It was one of the first really great finds that I made. So yeah, I don't want to part with it.
Yeah. So obviously you how would you describe your personal style in a few words?
Well, as I told you when we were corresponding on Instagram, my personal style at the moment is athleisure mum, which I never thought it would be. But, you know, I love to wear colourful. I'm definitely, even though I'm wearing black at the moment, I favour colour. I'm real Bowerbird. I like sparkly things. I like, you know, things that are a bit different. Definitely not a minimalist. I would never describe myself as a minimalist. Wait, was this 3 words?
Oh, no, it's all right. You're good.
That was a bit more than 3 words.
It's all good. I guess there's a lot of people in my life that can't get their heads around vintage because they don't know how to wear it. What are your tips for people to keep an elevated look but integrate vintage into their wardrobe?
I definitely think, to mix vintage back with modern pieces is the best way to do it. I think head to toe vintage doesn't do it for me at all. I think that can look very costumey. Like, I think, I guess it's a genre. You do see people who dress head to toe in clothing from another era, of one particular era, but I think that's not a modern look. So if you're going for a modern look, I think it's great to, you want to wear vintage as part of your everyday wardrobe. Like, I don't think it's necessary to be precious about it. And I think, fit is very important. You want to make sure you buy pieces that fit you and flatter you, just as you would with any other type of clothing. Fabrication. I think, people can try and buy vintage that's sort of in line with upcoming trends. I guess that's one way to kind of integrate vintage into your wardrobe in a way that's modern and elevated. But my personal instinct is just to go with what you love. If you're attracted to something, if you see something that you love, or you see a picture or a reference that, that attracts you in some way, like, just give it a go, have fun with it. I think vintage clothing is fun, and, that's something we all need.
Yeah. So in terms of, you're known in the fashion industry for having the creme de la creme of vintage pieces, and you've been able to source some amazing runway pieces, but I don't imagine that you have sourced those from Australia, or like, you're and as you said, you've traveled a lot. You've obviously collected from overseas. Do you still do most of your sourcing from overseas, or how?
Actually, Madeline, I, for the last couple of years, have tried to source as much product locally as I am able.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One has been the Australian dollar, obviously, is not good against the euro, against the US dollar. So that's, especially when you factor in shipping costs, can really make the conversion prohibitive. And I've been traveling less due to my life circumstances. So I've really been trying to source locally, and I've actually found some amazing things locally, including a collection of 300 to 400 pieces of vintage YSL, most of which had been never worn, which I found it from a woman in Melbourne, from one private collector in Melbourne, which I never dreamed that one person, particularly in Australia, would have that much vintage YSL sitting in boxes in a garage. But yeah, it is out there. It's out there in Australia. You'd be surprised. I mean, obviously the volume is much more overseas. Like America, for example, you can find a lot more stuff than you can here, but you can still find good stuff here. You just kind of have to dig a bit deeper.
Cara, one of the things that I found remarkable about what you've done personally, having been in the fashion industry in Sydney for, about 10 years, is you've brought vintage onto the red carpet and into celebrity looks in a way that I haven't seen other people do, like, in that time frame. How did you do that? How did you break through a mindset of, of bringing vintage into those forums?
One of my first customers was Kurt Cobain's daughter. And I had quite a few, and I still do, get quite a few actresses, models, it girls from New York, LA, London buying my vintage. I think that I don't want to say I was ahead of the curve, but I think for Australia, a lot of people probably didn't really understand what I was selling 8 years ago. I think the awareness now is a lot better, but you know, whereas in LA and London and New York, you know, that was already, vintage was already a huge thing. And you know, I had, for example, Bella Hadid's styling team contacting me. They found me on, I think, on Instagram and wanted to learn stuff. So that was crazy. I mean, that was kind of when she just broken through as this really hot new model. That was, you know, pretty amazing for me. I mean, I think especially when you run an online business, it's hard to know if you're even breaking. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you have a bricks and mortar store, you meet your customers, you see them every day, you talk to them, so you kind of see the effect you're having. But when you're purely online, it's kind of harder to measure the impact you're having, or whether, you know, what you're doing is, you know, cutting across to people. So that was pretty amazing.
So what happens when you get that phone call from Bella Hadid's team?
I mean, you know, I got an email and I thought it was a joke. I remember showing it to my flatmate at the time and being like, you know, this has got to be a joke. You know, like, I mean, to me, it was crazy that Bella Hadid styling team, which is based in LA, and the amount of amazing vintage that they have in LA. I mean, LA is probably one of the best places in the world for vintage. I thought, why on earth would they want, you know, why would they even bother to come to little me in Sydney? But yeah, that was legit. So that was amazing. That was just, I guess, very validating. Even though that experience was kind of had its ups and downs, let's say. But you know,
what were the ups and downs?
The ups is obviously getting that recognition, or, you know, that for myself, feeling like, wow, okay, you know, maybe I am on the right track here. You know, and it was amazing to see Bella Hadid wearing one of the pieces that I'd curated. You know, one of the pieces I'd found at a huge New York Fashion Week event. But there was a couple of drawbacks, which I haven't really spoken about before, but I'll share with you. One of them, and I think I've spoken to other vintage dealers international vintage dealers who have told me the same thing. And I've had this experience more than once. I think, for example, when you have your own brand and you dress a celebrity, the credit's always going to come back to the brand. When you dress a celebrity in vintage Chanel or vintage Givenchy, the dealer doesn't necessarily get acknowledged in the way that they should. So that was part of the experience, which was obviously disappointing because, you know, that kind of exposure can make a huge difference to a small business 100%. Like mine.
In terms of your business now, obviously vintage is a lot more of a hot topic amidst conversations of climate change and waste in the fashion industry. How are those conversations affecting you?
I think it's great for me. I mean, I think the sustainability angle of vintage is something that I never really consciously pushed as part of my brand story. That's not because I don't care about that. I guess I felt like sustainability and high fashion didn't necessarily kind of come together until very recently. I think until very recently, the idea of sustainability wasn't sexy. You know what I mean?
It was a bit more herbal, wasn't it?
It was a bit more herbal. It was a bit more hippie. It was a bit more, yeah, just exactly. A bit more Birkenstocky, like, but I think now, obviously, it's something that everyone wants to, you know, get involved in. And I think obviously with vintage, that's just, you know, part and parcel of what you're getting. I mean, this stuff it's been around for a long time. And, you know, that's the thing about vintage as well, is that it is sustainable, not just in that it's good for the environment, it's sustainable in that it's long lasting.
I think also now that we're starting to come out of this period of isolation, people are now sensing like a form of renewal. Are you going through any of that type of process where you feel like you're coming out a bit refreshed or with just a newer sense of self through this process?
So personally, I've been deep cleansing my closet, which is taking forever. But definitely, yeah. And I've been watching, there's a girl on Instagram actually who calls herself the Schmutter Shrink.
Right.
And she's actually a writer for Vogue in America, and she does closet cleansers. So I've been watching her videos and getting very inspired. And she's like, her goal when she does these closet cleansers, she wants to get rid of more than what she keeps, which to me is very extreme. Like, she'll start with 10 jumpers and then she'll end up with 4 jumpers, and that's a good result for her. To me, that's like very extreme. But, you know, I think like you only need as much as you're going to wear. I guess for me, there's somewhat of an archival aspect as well. Like, there are things like we discussed previously that I don't necessarily wear, but I do want to keep. But I definitely am looking at things that I've had hanging around for a long time and thinking, you know, do I really need this? Do I really want this? Can this find a better home? You know, in the spirit of vintage and secondhand and moving things along, you know, so I'm definitely doing that. And then in terms of Cara Mia vintage, I think the same thing. I think I'm looking at, you know, wanting my offering to be very highly curated so that I'm only offering really like the very best, which I think, you know, when I started Cara Mia vintage, that was my original goal. I think now I'm starting to just want to move back towards where I started and just, you know, hone in on those best pieces, because, you know, I actually have so much stock at the moment.
Where do you put it all?
Oh God, you don't want to know. It's overflowing, you know, and I just look. The thing with vintage clothing as well, and I don't know how much I subscribe to this, but I have spoken to various people about it. Like, this clothing did belong to someone else, a lot of it. I mean, you do get things that are unworn, but, you know, there is the idea that all of it does hold energy from its previous owners. And that's like, it's a chaotic thought that you've got, like, you know, I've got hundreds of pieces that belong to hundreds of different people, which in a way it's an amazing thought. And you can think about the stories behind all of these pieces and the lives that they lived, but it's also a little overwhelming to think about sometimes, and
the burden and the guilt of it.
Exactly. And, you know, what kind of energy is there, you know, running around my space? So yeah, I do have an impulse at the moment to kind of streamline in terms of Cara Mia vintage as well, and maybe offer quality over quantity at the moment.
In terms of Cara Mia, the words mean most beloved, correct, in Italian?
Yeah.
What what besides your Vivienne Westwood corsets are your most beloved or treasured pieces that you're kind of holding on to as your symbols of style?
Let me think. Well, like I told you before, the YSL collection that I found,
Yeah.
I did cherry pick. Well, I actually started selling it and then I sold off quite a good whack of it. And I thought, wait a second, there's not going to be anything left for me. So I did cherry pick a handful of special pieces that I thought, like a really great blazer, a trench coat, which I've never owned before. I've never really thought of myself as a trench coat person, but I thought, you know what? It's such a classic piece. And if you're going to have a trench coat, why not have a 70s YSL trench coat? Tons of stuff. There's an Alaya dress I just recently bought, which, sometimes Madeline, I buy things for the store and they arrive and I'm just like, no, I'm not letting you go. Pieces like that, even if you don't, a lot of people like the closet cleanser I was talking about. It's like, well, if you don't wear something for 6 months, you should get rid of it. I personally don't agree with that. I think sometimes you can have something in your wardrobe, maybe you don't touch it for years, but maybe one day you pull it out and you're like, yeah, this is something that works for me right now. And that's a piece you've had forever. And I think, maybe we just go through phases of our life. Right now you and I are deep in mum life and white silk blazers are not on the cards, but who knows where you're going to be in a year or 5 years or 10 years where that white blazer might become a closet staple for you.
Well, and I agree with you. I find getting rid of important things or valuable things really tough. So I just store them, and they're not necessarily hanging in my wardrobe, but they're there. And I think that for me, it's more like I've spent years building up this wardrobe. It's like I can't possibly wear everything, but this is that these things have been chosen, especially the well-made things have been chosen for a really good reason. It's and so I'm not just going to release that. They're part of my story, I guess, and that's what
exactly. And how exciting to open up that storage container and be like, wow, look at all this stuff that I forgot I had.
Yeah.
And because like we were saying before, like maybe now that's something that you are going to wear, and that is going to become, you've got this rotating wardrobe.
Yeah 100%. So as I said, we've gone through this funny period of lockdown where we sit today, we're not currently like out, but we're not currently in. And one of the questions I've been asking people is like, what's their coming out look? I guess the appropriate question is, what are you dying to have a great occasion to wear this item?
Well, that Alaya dress that I just mentioned, definitely dying for an occasion to wear it. And I have a pretty significant birthday coming up this year.
Oh, do you?
I won't mention the number, but I'm sure you can figure it out. Considering we're still together. So yeah, definitely what I have.
Are you saving the Alaya for that?
I think I might, because first of all, it's pretty tiny. Like, as in, it's not a kind of dress that you'd wear in winter anyway, unless it's a special occasion. And I can't really foresee that I'm going to have anywhere to wear it prior to that. So that probably won't be my coming out of COVID look. Look, to be honest with you, my goal is to get back into my old jeans. That's really, and that's not just a COVID goal, that's a post-baby goal.
Yeah.
So that's actually kind of what I'm working towards right now. Having not worn jeans for quite some time now. That's really my goal.
How are you going?
I'm getting there.
You look amazing. So
thank you. Yeah, I'm getting there, you know, slowly but surely.
Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Enjoyed it.
I'm really glad that we got a chance to connect.
Me too.
Finally. Whilst Cara appears to epitomise fashion mobility in Sydney, polished, articulate, and an admirer of luxury items, it's also her style to do things a little differently. Whether it be reclaiming runway Versace as a teenager or pioneering online vintage way before swings towards sustainability in the fashion industry, Cara has always been ahead of the curve. And it's this strong sense of self and an exacting eye that give her a point of difference in the vintage market and have seen her able to craft her most beloved hobby into a career.